ongoing onslaught on Gaza is not only a risk to stability in the Middle East, but a threat to global peace. More countries around the world have taken a strong stance against Israel's actions in Gaza and the atrocities committed in this conflict. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. And on the show tonight, we take a look at the war in the Middle East. Will the Israeli-Palestinian conflict ever be resolved? Joining me in studio for this discussion is Zane Dangor, Director General at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. I'm also joined by Abeedah Adams from the Palestine Solidarity campaign via Zoom, and from the Jewish Board of Deputies, we are joined by Zev Krengel, who is in our Durban studio. Before we embark on our discussion tonight, producer Andrew Mokhatle has compiled the following report.
With the Israel-Hamas war showing no sign of abating, voices from the international community to bring the conflict to an end are mounting. Last week, the United Nations Security Council adopted its first resolution since the outbreak of the war on the 7th of October. Sponsored by Malta, the resolution called for urgent humanitarian pauses and corridors in Gaza to address the escalating crisis for Palestinian civilians. The vote in the 15-member council proceeded without the United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom, which abstained.
It focuses in particular on the plight of children trapped in the war enclave and of those being held hostage. Over the past week, we have held extensive consultations with Council members, interested parties, countries in the region, and humanitarian organizations.
The key elements of this resolution and what they mean in practice for the people of Gaza must not be underestimated. For the children and other Palestinians sheltering from the hostilities, for the Israeli children and others still held hostage.
Although the United States is deeply disappointed by what is not in this text, we support many of the important provisions this Council has adopted.
According to officials in the besieged territory, over 13,000 people, including more than 5,000 children, have been killed due to Israeli attacks on Gaza. The World Health Organization says Gaza's largest hospital has become a death zone. Echoing the same sentiments, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said Gaza was becoming a graveyard for children.
Gaza is becoming a graveyard for children. Hundreds of girls and boys are reportedly being killed or injured every day. More journalists have reportedly been killed over a 4-week period than in any conflict in at least 3 decades.
Last week, South Africa referred Israel to the International Criminal Court for all crimes committed by Israel in Gaza. The Office of the President says a lot of lives could have been saved if the ICC moved quickly on its previous investigations of war crimes allegedly committed by Israel. Tonight we are asking, will the Israeli-Palestinian conflict ever be resolved? Andrew Mokhatle, Unfiltered, SABC News.
Welcome back to Unfiltered. Mr. Dangor, what are your reactions to today's parliamentary vote regarding the Israeli embassy in South Africa?
So we expected that vote to take place and we expected the outcome. Of course, from an international relations policy perspective, we would need to take instruction from the executive. Foreign policy is the domain of the executive and not parliament. So if the executive decides that this is a course of action that they feel is rational and that government should implement, of course, then government will have to follow that route. But the executive does not necessarily follow on from what parliament has said directly.
And do you expect the executive to do that?
I can't second guess the executive says where. I think the executive will probably engage with what the parliamentary vote is, listen to some of the debates, listen to the public sentiment, and come to some kind of decision. And they would probably then inform government as to what the course of action should be.
And just in terms of the outcome of this vote, are you expecting any repercussions from this vote that would either be detrimental or beneficial to South Africa's foreign policy?
I don't think it could be detrimental to South Africa's foreign policy. I think the outcomes of the vote is an expression of what the majority of parliamentarians are feeling. I think they're also making the assumption that it is the sentiment of the majority of South Africans at this stage. In essence, this is the democratic process, and even some of the countries that we engage with will look at this as an outcome of a democratic process. Of course, as I said, the executive will weigh all these kinds of options up and give us some kind of instruction either way on what to do.
Ms. Adams, your view on today's vote in Parliament and your reaction to it?
Thank you, Sizwe. We of course welcome the vote. We also do feel that, this should have been done a lot earlier. It's been one of our key pillars for the Palestine Solidarity campaign to say that we need to cut diplomatic ties with the Zionist state of Israel. So, of course, for us, it's a step in the right direction. And we do believe this is also because of the kind of pressure that organizations like the PSC and other solidarity organizations of the people of Palestine has put on parliamentarians. And of course, we also expect the executive to actually heed this call because we know the prerogative lies with them. So we would also implore them to actually respect this motion that was passed in Parliament and to actually action it. Because we think it's important that similarly as South Africa was isolated during the years of apartheid, that we know that the only way we can stop the genocide and we can have a ceasefire is if we isolate the apartheid state of Israel.
Mr. Krengel, how do you view today's vote in Parliament, and what's your response to the events as they've unfolded today?
Well, we're very, very disappointed. I think South African Parliament today has become a laughing stock. We had it. I'm getting an echo here, so it's very hard for me to talk, but I'll carry on.
Apologies for that.
I do think that the South African Parliament, literally the EFF controls it with its 10%. Please. I do think that the EFF actually controls Parliament with its 9%. I think the ANC just runs after the tail. They did the same with the expropriation of that compensation. They do with many other things. So I think, the ANC doesn't show the leadership we need in this country. But I think personally, it's a very sad day for the vast majority of South African jury that have been in this country for over 250 years. We've never seen this with any other conflict. I mean, we literally watching a disaster unfold in the DRC. That's in our continent. 1.5 million babies will be born undernourished, malnourished this year alone. That's more than the entire of Gaza, and no parliament of South Africa is even having the discussion. So we do believe it's because it's the Jewish state that it's got this incredible uproar from the EFF and the ANC. But I think for me as a proud South African, our South African parliaments become a laughing stock where people get beaten up, where people get pushed out, where the president can't talk. This wasn't meant to be 30 years ago. This wasn't what we all fought for to get out. So very disappointing. I think the biggest loser in today's vote is normal fellow South Africans. South Africans that don't have a parliament that really worries about their own people and has made it a parliament of thugs and thuggery, and where the ruling party follows a minority party continuously to try and appease itself. So a very, very sad day for South Africa.
Mr. Dangor, how do you respond to that?
Look, I think that we must respect the parliamentary processes. I think we shouldn't diminish the kinds of debates and discussions that have taken place, whether we agree with the vote or not. There's many votes in Parliament that many of us will agree with and many of us will not agree with. But I think we must engage with what's being said, what's driving the sentiment, and also to argue that these are not the kinds of issues that we take, well, as a government, we take all the conflicts seriously. We've got engagements in the DRC, Sudan. You've seen the work that we've done on Ethiopia. We've appointed people to deal with the Great Lakes conflicts. Of course, myself and the National Security Advisor are constantly engaged with the peace process in Ukraine. So we do take these processes very seriously. I think this particular conflict, or whatever we're going to call it, the war on Gaza, the war in Gaza, is particularly painful because it's unfolding in front of the eyes of many It's being televised. I think the brutality that we're seeing, I think the president spoke about the atrocities. Earlier on in your show, you pointed out on the fatality rates. It's about 2% of Gazans that have been killed. If you take that percentage and you extrapolate it to the US, it's about 8 million people. So percentage-wise, it's a significant amount. When we were last year, myself, on this very show, about 2 weeks after the conflict began with Daniel Levy, we looked at a death rate then of about 3,000. We're now sitting at over 13,000. Then we were calling for a ceasefire. A ceasefire was resisted. At least the Security Council has now finally agreed, not to a ceasefire, but at least to a series of humanitarian pauses. I think this is important because if one listens to, for example, Dr. Mads Gilbert and others who worked in that space for many, many years, what is needed now is the immediate end to the killing, the immediate end to the mass injuries, because these mass injuries are taking place in an environment where the healthcare system has been systematically degraded, where access to food is being severely restricted, access to water, access to medicine. These are all the means in which to sustain life. And we don't see this as being accidental, you're seeing as being systemic.
Can I put some of what you've said there in response back to our guest, Mr. Krengel? Because, of course, the parliamentary vote today, on the one hand, was about the Israeli embassy in Pretoria, but it was also about this question of a ceasefire, which has been a raging global debate. What is your view on this question of whether South Africa's parliament was correct to call for a ceasefire? Quite separate from the question of the embassy.
So coming back to Mr. Dangor, first of all, he is correct. We try and get involved in all different conflicts throughout the world. But our posture has always been a non-aligned posture. We came under a lot of pressure because of us supporting Russia, because of us inviting Putin for the BRICS summit. And President Ramaphosa spent a fortune of time in Ukraine, in Russia, trying to understand the conflict. But when it comes to the Jewish state, when it comes to Israel, we haven't had an ambassador there since 2017. There hasn't been an envoy there. There hasn't been fact-finding missions in Israel. We've actually given nothing since President Mbeki sent the ANC there in 2006. So for the last 16, 18 years, we have taken a policy of full-blown alignment against Israel. That's made us irrelevant to really help the people of Gaza, the people of the Palestinian Authority, and the people of Israel. So I think it's a grave mistake we have made. We've made ourselves irrelevant. And I just think it's a very, very sad day that all South Africa is doing is whipping itself up, creating the highest levels of anti-Semitism this country's ever seen in its history. Threats on the community, threats on Jewish people, anyone who doesn't agree with what they say. A Christian prayer was disrupted on the seafront. People were beaten up. There was a legal march where 3,000 people weren't allowed to get off the buses. We have imported this conflict from the Middle East, and the government seems to be fueling it, and the ANC and the EFF seem to be fueling it. So I think from that point of view, it's incredibly disappointing that the South African government can't even try and show a little bit of this non-aligned posture that it's done on every other conflict. So I think that's really been a hell of a very sad day. I think the other thing that needs
let me
to really
ask
be
Ms. Adams to come in there, Mr. Krengel.
We see it on TV.
Mr. Krengel, could I just ask our other guest to come in? We will come back to you on that, but let me ask Ms. Adams to respond to the response of Mr. Krengel. What do you say to that? The question actually was about the ceasefire, but he's responded to some of the comments made by Mr. Dangor as well. How do you respond to that?
Yes, Sizwe, I think, the fact that we believe that it's taken our government and even the parliament very long to even get to that resolution and to call for the ceasefire. That should have been done weeks ago. So many lives has already been lost. And any life lost, that is a life too many that has been lost. I mean, if we look in terms of the statistics and the number of children that has been killed and murdered during this genocide, we can't call it any other thing. It's deliberate, it's ethnic cleansing, it is complete destruction of infrastructure, of the welfare, the health system in Gaza. There is nothing left. There is nothing left. I mean, Gaza is still under siege. No food can go in, and we know that there is a humanitarian crisis unfolding on our TVs. Every day we see it on different forms of social media, and we cannot be calling ourselves human and wanting just to sit aside idly by and wait for whoever to intervene. I mean, we have heard the stories, the countless stories of Hamas, and we have seen very little proof. But what we have seen every day is thousands upon thousands of people, innocent civilians, have been murdered by the Israeli occupation force. Now, coming to the issue of the parliament and saying, I mean, the EFF is what did we say, about 10% of the parliamentarians, and the ANC has got 230 MPs. There is no way that that argument that, that the EFF is running the show in Parliament. But for us as the PSC, we must commend the EFF for taking the lead in this. This should have been done a long, long while ago, because we need to just look at our very own, our painful history and our past. We come from a past of occupation and from colonization. Therefore, for us, it is important for South Africa. It's our political and moral responsibility to be leading on this, not just in South Africa, but internationally. So we must set an example. We cannot want to be having relations with a Zionist murderous state who's calling other human beings vermin, who's threatening them with atomic nuclear bombs and all these kind of things. So this is, I just heard last night in the talk of Dr. Mads Gilbert, where he's actually referring to even the United States has lost control of the state of Israel. So we can't be saying this is exactly what our democracy is about. This is what we said during the apartheid years. This is what we fought for. So when we got our freedom, it was not just freedom and democracy and human rights for South Africa, but it was for the rest of the world. So it's important for South Africa to have taken the stance. We do believe that we should not be having, so it should not be a temporary cut of diplomatic ties with the state of Israel.
Right, and let me come back to Mr. Dangor, and we have a long discussion ahead, and I'm aware that the different guests will want to respond, and you'll all be given an opportunity. But just as we go to our break, Mr. Dangor, there is this charge that we prevaricated on Russia and Ukraine when we've been quite clear on the Palestinian question. What do you say to that charge?
I think the first thing we must do is make a distinction between non-aligned and active non-alignment between what the stance we're taking in Palestine. So with the active non-alignment in Ukraine and Russia, it's a more symmetrical warfare. It's not completely symmetrical because Russia's army is bigger. It's also a nuclear power, but Ukraine army has also got the backing of significant countries in the West, and they're being armed. So it's two armies against each other. We've also said very clearly, despite we may have had missteps here and there, that the use of force by Russia is unlawful, despite being non-aligned. We said targeting of civilians and breaking the principle of distinction is unlawful. We've made those statements. With the situation in Palestine, it's asymmetrical. It's an occupying power against people that it occupies. You've got a standing army, one of the biggest in the world, also a nuclear power, against essentially militia, no standing army. And essentially following from that perspective, and given the unlawful nature of an occupying army using armed force and declaring war against the people that they're occupying, we have to take a very different stance from the one that we're taking in Russia, Ukraine.
Right. Let's cut to a break. We're discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the situation in Gaza, with a panel of government and different perspectives in civil society. Stick with us as we return to explore the question of South Africa's referral of this matter to the International Criminal Court and what that means for South Africa's foreign affairs and indeed for international relations. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And of course, we had massive news last week as South Africa referred this question to the International Criminal Court. States can refer matters to the International Criminal Court and ask them to investigate something that's going on. And that's called a referral under Article 14 of the Rome Statute. Can you give us your reaction to the president's announcing that and why South Africa has taken this extraordinary step?
Look, I think we considered the unfolding events. We looked at the fact that very obviously, given that you have a belligerent occupation, so there's a nexus between conflicts, so war crimes comes to the equation. So the war crimes, the principle of distinction, and various elements of war crimes have been breached. Again, crimes of humanity again. The forced starvation, deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure. There's a whole range of issues. The differential treatment of people. So the crimes against humanity was also one. Genocide, of course, the third of the four horses of the apocalypse. So genocide, the crime of genocide turns on intent. It turns on whether there's a stated intent to destroy in whole or in part a distinct grouping of people, whether it's based on ethnicity, religion, but it must be an identified group. And we've seen, it doesn't just mean mass killings. It means mass killings in most cases, so the gravity issue comes into perspective. But what we've also seen, normally the crime of genocide, the biggest issue to prove is intent. But as Craig Mokima, I think I'm getting this name, maybe wrong, from the UN indicated, is that in this case you see the crime of intent with the statements of intention of genocide coming from many Israeli leaders, from the flattening of Gaza. So we can go into the details of that, but we felt that all three crimes had resonance, and therefore we referred them as state parties together with 4 other states, including Bolivia, Bangladesh, Djibouti, and Comoros. And others are intending to join as well, for the ICC to investigate. I must point out that there is a referral since 2018. There was a referral from the Palestinian Authority for previous attacks on Gaza and also other attacks on the West Bank. And what we've done in our referral is refer to the 2018 one, and also we don't make the point in the papers, but I think the president had made it in the briefing, is that there was an attempt to block the 2018 investigation and then delay it by many states, arguing that the ICC did not have jurisdiction. So there was an entire legal hearing in the chamber. The chamber confirmed in 2021 that the ICC has jurisdiction because Palestine had put itself under the jurisdiction of the ICC. And the point that's been made is if that was investigated then already, it may have put in place the kind of chill factor that would have allowed, maybe prevented this current round of atrocities from taking place. We do believe that these crimes must be investigated fairly. We believe there should be urgency by the prosecutor to do this because there's been a lot of foot dragging, to put it mildly. And we will, as state parties, follow up with the Office of the Prosecutor to ensure that this does happen.
Absolutely. And Mr. Krengel, I wonder what your reaction to South Africa's decision to refer this matter to the International Criminal Court is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely astounded. I mean, this is the same government that 7 years ago had Bashir, who had a warrant for his arrest by the RCC, come and visit this country against that warrant for arrest. We have been reprimanded as South Africans by the RCC for that. The DA took it to court, which if it happens again, we'll get United Nations sanctions. Then we wanted to leave the Rome Statute. Then we wanted to leave the RCC. Then President Putin gets his arrest warrant for what he's done, while we keep it on a non-aligned posture where we're very friendly with Putin after he's also got his arrest warrant, and then we invite him as the president of Russia, who's got an arrest warrant by the RCC, to South Africa, which literally could have caused incredible harm to this country. And our President Ramaphosa has to do some very fancy footwork to try and explain why we can't have him there. And at the process, the government tries to look at trying to get out of the RCC, out of the Rome Statute. Now, all of a sudden, the RCC is in favor. The government of South Africa can't use the RCC as a departmental store. It can't decide when it doesn't like someone, when it doesn't like the Jewish state, well, now we're going to take it. But when we like other murderers, when you like other dictators, when you like other people who have warrants for their arrest, then all of a sudden, not only don't we want to be part of that, not only won't we do what the RCC instructs us to do, we actually go against the RCC, and then we look at trying to get out of the Rome Statute. So we have to decide. We're either in or out. You can't keep flipping and flopping. And that's what's made South Africa so irrelevant in the last 30 years of international relations. We've become irrelevant in the sense that we decide what we want the outcome to be, and then we decide where we want to go to get that outcome. So, I mean, South Africa's got a much worse reputation in the RCC than Israel currently, because it's been reprimanded by the RCC for allowing someone with an arrest warrant for genocides, for mass crimes against humanity, come into South Africa and be a guest of the South African ANC government. I think it's outrageous that this is the way now they want to proceed with it. I'm flabbergasted.
Ms. Adams, how do you respond to that and the charges of hypocrisy on South Africa's part as it relates to the ICC referral?
Look, I think we disagree there. Of course, we would disagree on probably everything, but I just think that Mr. Krengel is not responding to the issue here about the ICC. This is an important step for us. If you think back in terms of the history, I've heard what Mr. Dangor said about the technicalities and, when it is can be seen as a genocide or as a war crime, but we do believe that this should have been done long ago. If you, for example, look at Gaza, Gaza has been under siege for more than 17 years. If we look at 75 years of occupation since the Nakba, that is since 1948, how many innocent Palestinian lives hasn't been lost? In fact, should the state of Israel not have been referred many, many years ago, many decades ago? I mean, even if we look at the war of 1967, but then in addition to that, I mean, we've tried all the diplomatic channels. The state of Israel has not abided by anyone even of the UN resolutions where it has condemned them for their actions. So this is a state that has been acting with impunity, but with the support of the United States, but also with the support of most of the European Union countries and countries like the UK and Germany, etc. So there's been this thing that, for us, what we just see, we see the contradiction, and how very quickly that Putin was charged. But there has been, as even Mr. Dangor referred to, as the Palestinian Authority's attempt already in 2018 to have the state of Israel charged for genocide. And I mean, if we just look, in terms of the definition, in terms of what are the requirements at the ICC, this is a very, very clear case. We can see in terms of the statements being made, not just by Netanyahu, but also by his whole cabinet. It's been, where they have been openly and publicly say that we will clear Gaza of any presence of any Palestinian and that kind of thing. So there is no doubt in our mind that this is indeed the right step. And this is something that the PSC has been campaigning for many, many years, to say that the state of Israel must be taken to the ICC. So for us, we welcome the step, but we do want to see more action, because we do believe that there's been a lot of delays, unnecessary delays. We do feel that this should have happened many, many years ago already. And it's important also then, because this is also how the South African society in the South Africa is feeling at the moment. So it's not necessarily us changing, but I think it's also government is finally responding to the pressure that we have been putting on the state. We have written numerous letters to our government. We've written numerous letters to DIRCO, and we haven't just stopped there. For example, we have asked our National Prosecuting Authority to charge South Africans who serve in the Israeli occupation force, because we do have legislation even around that. So there are a number of other things that we feel that our government can and should be doing and should have done already.
Let's come to that question, because it does bear on questions of international relations. South Africans also serving in the Israeli Defense Force. What's DIRCO's position on that, and are you inquiring into that?
So can I just come back quickly on the ICC matter? And see, I think what we mustn't do is look at what happened with Bashir and make that the yardstick for what we should be doing with Palestine. I think the fact that South Africa had decided not to exit from the Rome Statute is indicative of huge debates within our society, and including within political parties. And in the end, the issue of us being committed to ending impunity reigned. And we saw that this Apex Court and the statute that established it is perhaps still the best tool to deal with impunity. Some of us have penned articles from as far back as 2016, for example, why we should not exit the Rome Statute and why it's important to deal with global impunity. And I think that is the yardstick, is yes, there was missteps with the Bashir matter. The courts ruled on that. With Putin, we were very clear. We made very public statements. We will stick to what we know is our national obligations and our international obligations. And the invitation to President Putin came before the warrant of arrest was issued. And I think we must just correct that, not afterwards. And that was even in the court papers. So we mustn't look at the yardsticks of what we may or may not have done right with what we should be doing right. And ending impunity is important. And in this case, we think we are doing the right thing. And that is what we must be judged on. On the issue of people going and fighting in the Israeli army, we are looking at the act. We are looking at whether the act can be used to actually charge people to go and fight in a war that has been described as part of a belligerent occupation. So as the minister in the presidency indicated, we will be looking at this.
Mr. Krengel, your thoughts on as we wrap up this segment, this question of the ICC, and I'm afraid we do have to go to a break relatively soon, but we will come back to you after that.
No, I just think it's amazing that the DG calls allowing a man of Bashir, which was literally a arrest warrant for genocide, crimes against humanity, a misstep. A misstep. I mean, come on. You totally ignored the RCC there because it wasn't good for you and it wasn't good for the government. Then you come all very proud now that no, Putin, we were going to listen. But the Secretary General of the ANC made it very clear that Putin was allowed to come and we must leave the RCC and we must leave the Rome Statute. You can't take your cake and eat it. You can't have both sides of the coin here. You're going to have to decide. And please, I think it's an embarrassment to the RCC. I think it's an embarrassment to South African society to say when you've invited and you allowed the man of Bashir to come to our shores was a misstep. And you quickly had to get out of it. That wasn't a misstep. That was a deliberate putting it in the face of the RCC that we don't care about you. Now all of a sudden, so really I think it's an incredible, to call it a misstep. I must say that's quite phenomenal. When it comes to the fighting of foreigners, once again, it comes back to one thing. Every other conflict, the government doesn't care, the government doesn't want. We had ISIS, we had South Africans who went to fight for ISIS, went to fight to Islamic State. They went all over the world. They came back. We accepted them. They're in our society. You have South Africans that are fighting in the Royal Marines every single year. They fought in the Iraq campaign. They fought in Afghanistan. Over 7,000 of them fought in those two campaigns. Not a word, not a word. Now all of a sudden, Jewish state, all of a sudden, the South African government's found a voice and is looking into it. Well, if you've got to look at Jews, you must look at everyone. You must look at people who have fought in the Royal Marines, and you must look at people who have fought in known terrorist state conflicts. You can't have a departmental store to attack the Jewish state all the time, especially when it affects your Jewish community as much as it's been affecting us. Every single time it blows up, it gets imported, and yes, you've got a lot of pure interest groups. They don't care about South Africans. No one cares. I mean, we're not free in this country. 37% unemployment. Our education's terrible. We're not a free society.
Mr. Krengel,
we can't worry.
Let's go to a break, and we'll come back after that.
Murdered, raped in this country. We're not a free society.
Let's cut to a break. We're having a debate on the Israeli-Palestinian situation. The government has referred the matter to the International Criminal Court. And when we come back from the break, if that wasn't enough, BRICS held an extraordinary meeting today on the question, and we'll be coming back to analyze South Africa's role in that and get our panelists' views on the extraordinary BRICS meeting. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Mr. Krengel, can I just come back to you? Because I have asked some of my other guests about hypocrisy in South Africa's positions on the ICC and other conflicts. But you haven't yet come squarely to the question of Israel's actions in this conflict. Do you think they're defensible? without reference to other conflicts, which, let's agree for the moment, are equally worrying whenever death occurs around the world. But in terms of Israel's actions themselves, do you think that Israel has been disproportionate in its actions, even committed war crimes, some even suggesting as far as genocide, or do you believe that its actions have been defensible?
So first of all, everyone loves to run to the end. You have to go to the beginning. Israel left Gaza 100% in 2005. It took every single Jew out. It did exactly what the Nazis did. It literally made a Jew free. Jew free, that's what they wanted. That's what then the PA was in charge. That was the demand. No, the synagogues had to be taken down. The greenhouses were taken down. Everyone was gone. Every Jew was gone out of Gaza. From 2005 up until 2007, the relationship between Gaza and Israel was actually fine. Everything was, there was no fences, there was no borders, there was no nothing. People like to forget that Hamas did an illegal coup on the PLO, which used to be the brothers in arms of the ANC. But now the ANC has chosen a radical Islamic jihadist organization which wants the death of all Jews and the death of all Christians, and that's their new big partners. Hamas does that coup against the PLO in 2007. Israel has to help President Mahmoud Abbas and the rest of the PLO to go into exile into Ramallah because they can't stay in Gaza because they will be killed by Hamas. People like to forget that. Now you move forward, and from that moment, Hamas is when all the trouble comes. Because Hamas isn't interested in a peaceful solution. Hamas wants to kill Jews, and Hamas wants to kill Christians. And the sooner we work that out, the quicker this conflict can be over.
So can I ask you about the specific question?
Then you want to move forward to where we are now.
Yes.
6th of October, there is a ceasefire. Everyone, just hang on. You have to give me time here. On the 6th of October, there is a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, negotiated by the Egyptians. There's a ceasefire. They get billions of dollars for it. There's a ceasefire. Hamas broke the ceasefire by coming across a border, massacring, burning, beheading, and raping, and it's all been documented. All been documented. Our government, the ANC South African government, hasn't gone to the ICC for what happened on the 7th of October, hasn't even gone to look at the pictures, haven't even gone
Mr.
to
Krengel,
find out, hasn't done one fact-finding mission, because it was Jews that were murdered.
Mr.
And
Krengel,
what's even worse, it wasn't even Jews, there were Germans, there were Tanzanians. A Tanzanian was killed in custody. South Africa never said a word. A fellow African country, 2 people on agricultural scholarship.
Mr. Krengel,
where it starts. This conflict is over tomorrow when Hamas stops wanting to kill Jews and Christians. And the only way you're going to get that is when the PLO can come back into Gaza, and South Africa needs to help that happen. South Africa has to stop supporting radical Islam. It has to stop supporting
Mr. Krengel, I do hope you appreciate.
ISIS. And when that happens, maybe we'll have a chance.
Okay. Well, my question was about the recent violence in Gaza, which we still haven't approached, but let's come to Ms. Adams there, because we can talk about the BRICS summit, or the extraordinary meeting, which we will do. We can talk about the ICC, but ultimately the crux of this issue is the situation in Gaza right now, and of course the events building up to that, on which we've done a show as well. And once again, I mean, we don't need to go back to the horrors of October the 6th and 7th. But at the end of the day, this is a question about Israel's actions on the ground in Gaza right now. And what is your view on those actions? Why do you believe that you would go to the extreme of the characterization of genocide and not simply the characterization of war crimes or unjust war, as some have characterized it?
I think, Sizwe, if we can refer to the statements of Netanyahu and his cabinet, and also the actions. I mean, we've had just testimony. I went to the talk last night, for example, on Mads Gilbert, and this is a medical doctor with a lot of experience there. And just in terms of what has been happening, and because he still got some contact with some people, it's intermittent contact. But in terms of what people are saying, so this is not just a war, and I mean, even it is not even abiding by the Geneva Conventions. How do we justify, for example, switching of incubators, taking doctors out, forcing doctors away from their patients, having sniper fires? That is the testimonies that we've heard from people at Al-Shifa Hospital. There is no way that, and then also because before the 7th of October, for example, we know that most of the hospitals in Gaza was not fully functional. But since 7th of October, there is no capacity. I mean, I just heard earlier on the news what the World Health Organization has said. It's not just the fact that they cannot cope with all the wounded and the dead and all people who need hospital and emergency care. There's a lack of fuel, there's a lack of electricity, but it's also there is no infrastructure. I mean, we have seen that how complete infrastructure has been completely destroyed, completely limiting and completely. So there's a blockage on Gaza. I mean, nothing can go in. We know that of the trucks that is standing at the border to get in and all these things that we know and we know also that if people do not get the help, they will be starving to death. There is no water. There is no, for me, it was so shocking that last week we heard that Palestinian people were surviving on old biscuits and dates and drinking dirty water. So what is that if that is not a genocide? I mean, I keep on hearing Mr. Krengel talking about, beheadings, etc., but we have not seen any evidence of this. I mean, the Israeli occupation force is blocking even people from Gaza. I mean, journalists have been targeted. How many health professionals have been killed and targeted as well? And this we see as deliberate, it is systematic, and it's been happening not just now. I mean, this has been happening all over the time. Right. How long has Gaza been sealed off?
And let's put some of the debate to you, Mr. Dangor, as well. And I know you would like to respond to some of it. How do you respond to how the debate is unfolding?
This situation is incredibly bad. The atrocities is bad. And as we deal with it, we must try and stick to fact as much as possible. So let's deal with these things in a number of ways. So just take the ICC thing, for example. President in his opening statements today at BRICS reinforced what we've said again. We are referring the situation in Palestine and Israel to the ICC. We mentioned the previous 2018 referral, but then we say there's new crimes under the ICC's jurisdiction that must be investigated. Like we've said, that we recognize under the Geneva Conventions and occupied and oppressed people right to use force, but they must obey the Geneva Conventions, and that's why the president and we are saying that where Hamas has committed war crimes, they must be investigated. Where Israel has committed war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, it must be investigated and investigated fully. So I think we must just put that to bed. I mean, that's a factual statement. When it comes to South Africa, the government's engagements, we engage with the Palestinian Authority on a daily basis. We engage with the PLO on a daily basis. I don't think the assertion that South Africa is not engaging with the PLO and shirking the PLO for Hamas is accurate or true. Hamas is the de facto authority in Gaza, and we engage with all the major stakeholders in that space. For example, we get told about phone calls that the minister made. The minister did not actively go and make a phone call, as Zev Krengel said before, on speed dial. There was a formal request that came through the desk from the authorities in Gaza. We suggested that she take the call because it's important given the unfolding humanitarian conditions. And all they discussed was the humanitarian issues. So I do think that we're creating bogeymen to deflect from what the real issue is. Okay? And I think a simple engagement with President Abbas, and the PLO, for example, was part of a delegation of the Arab League and the organizations of Islamic countries going around to the leaders of the Security Council, the Permanent Five, to ask for urgent movement towards a ceasefire and the opening of humanitarian corridors. Will give you a sense that the Palestinians are united in looking for a ceasefire at this moment. So The second issue, my last point before I give up, the idea that we need to build divisions between Muslims, Christians, and Jews as we unravel and deal with this conflict is one that we should all debunk. You know, the opposition to what's happening is emerging from many, many people of the Jewish faith, and they are not fringe. Jewish Voice for Peace, South African Jews for Free Palestine are not fringe. B'Tselem in Israel is not fringe. Breaking the Silence is not fringe. They're making more or less the same calls that the vast majority of people in the world is making. And creating divisions between Muslims, Christians, and Jewish people is not useful. For example, Palestinians have always been, historically been Jewish, Muslim, and Christian. And for various reasons, mostly because of partition, these divisions occurred. The oldest church in Gaza, one of the oldest churches in the world, was recently bombed by the Israeli Defense Force. And we must bear all of that in mind when we start becoming alarmist about, you know, religious and ethnic affiliations. And I'm raising this because we need to actually move away from the South African government. My last point.
We just need to go to a break, sure, and then we will come back. We still have another segment to go where we will traverse these issues, questions of religion and its intersection with this conflict, as well as the way forward. Don't forget to comment on social media at Unfiltered SABC, and we'll round off the conversation when we come back. Welcome back to Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations. Mr. Dangor, before we went to the break, you were just rounding off a point about the intersection of religion and this conflict.
Yeah, I think we must look at values. We mustn't look at only the confessional preferences of people. And where the issue of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hatred emerges, we must take strong action against that, whether it's in South Africa or elsewhere.
Absolutely.
We must make sure that the kinds of struggles that the Palestinians are waging against occupation isn't used for mobilizing bias against Jewish people and fomenting anti-Semitism. In the same vein, we should be wary of fomenting Islamophobia and even anti-Christian hatred. I think these are the kind of issues we must take seriously if we are advocating for peace, and we are advocating for a long and a just and lasting solution to the situation, which means the occupation must end, and we must focus on that.
Absolutely. And can I just stick with you, because of course we had this very rare meeting of BRICS nations today around this question. Do you think it was a successful meeting from the South African international relations perspective? And what do you think comes out of that meeting that's important?
Look, I think the major takeaways from that meeting is that heads of state came together from the 5 BRICS countries, with India's foreign minister attended. But essentially, the end result is that there's a call for an end to the atrocities that are happening. There's a call for ensuring that there's a pause or a ceasefire, most calling for the ceasefire, and that there's a just and lasting solution to be found. Almost all talked about a 2-state solution along the 1967 borders, which is the prevailing internationally agreed parameters. So I think it's just reinforcing these heads of states lending their voices to an urgent matter that needs urgent resolution.
Indeed. Mr. Krengel, we are just rounding off the show at this stage. So in around 2 minutes, which I'll afford each of you, could you just summarize your final thoughts and anything further that you'd like to add?
Unfortunately for Mr. Dangor, we do represent the vast majority of South African Jewry. The UCT independent survey, 96% of South African Jews support the State of Israel and believe it has a right to exist. We currently understand the Jewish community. Mr. Dangor doesn't. Maybe he understands other communities. Maybe he can talk. What he always talks about is the Jews for Palestine. It keeps reminding me of, I was brought up in apartheid, and I used to have hundreds of thousands of black people paraded on the SABC showing how wonderful apartheid is for South Africa with the Bantu states. And they paraded it, and that's what the ANC does, that's what the government. Don't tell me what my community is feeling. The Jewish community the Board of Deputies represent this community for 120 years. We are the representatives. If you want to find Jews with your way of life, with what you believe, you will find them. Trust me, you will find them. But they don't represent South African Jewry. And if you're not going to listen to the main bodies of South African Jewry, you are behaving like the apartheid government behaved, left when it was talking to Lucas Magope and not talking to Oliver Tambo. So don't talk to people you have the same ideology and you believe in. Talk to the people who represent the people. That's what the apartheid regime got so wrong. The ANC represented 2/3 of black people in this country. It wasn't the Lucas Magope, it wasn't the Bobotswanas. So until you can come to that point, and until the president can actually return our call and meet with us, it shows that you only want to talk to people who have your view. And that is why this country is oozing with anti-Semitism. You say there's no place for anti-Semitism. Outside the US consulate, Pagad members who have gone to jail called for the death for Jews. We have given everything to the police, not a word. The government hasn't protected one single Jew from Jewish hatred. There's been beaten up. There was a Jew driving a rabbi who got beaten up on the side of the road. Not a thing, not a thing. There was what happened in Durban. The threats on our children at Herzliya. Our government does nothing, So don't give us words, because your words are not helping us at the moment. You are talking to a mirror, and you're talking to Jews that you like because they listen to your ideology. It's not our ideology. When
I must just give Ms. Adams a chance to
South African Jews, come and talk to the board. Get the president to come and talk to us.
Thank you. Ms. Adams, I'm afraid we don't have much time left, but just any further concluding thoughts in the 30 seconds that we do have.
I just want to say, Sizwe, that, the PSC, we are a secular organization. We are not anti-Jewish. We are against Zionism. We actually have a lot of Jewish members in our organization. Some of our most committed members are Jews, and we also have members of all the different faiths. We have got Muslims there, we've got agnostics, we've got atheists, and we also have Christians. So for us, this is not a fight about religion.
Right.
The PSC believes this is a fight against imperialism and occupation, and that is why we are standing with the people of Palestine, and we will always be on solidarity with the people of Palestine.
Well, let me thank you and all of our panelists this evening as we've dissected recent international relations events, not only the parliamentary vote today about the Israeli embassy, but also the ICC referral, as well as the extraordinary BRICS meeting, all involving this question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's continue this conversation on social media at Unfiltered SABC, and make sure to tune in for further unfiltered news, unfiltered views, and unfiltered conversations. Have a good evening.